I never expected a job at a small neighborhood store to change the course of my life. A few years ago, I was hired to work at a small retail shop that sold household goods, seasonal decorations, and various everyday items. It wasn't a glamorous job, but I was grateful to have stable employment. The owners seemed friendly during the interview, and they promised a supportive work environment. That promise didn't last long. At first, I convinced myself that every workplace has problems. Maybe the long hours were temporary. Maybe being understaffed was normal for a small business. Maybe things would improve once the owners hired more people. They never did. The store usually operated with the absolute minimum number of employees possible. Most shifts had only one worker on duty. If business was slow, the owners considered that proof that one person was enough. If business was busy, they simply expected us to work faster. Being alone in the store meant doing everything. I operated the register. I stocked shelves. I cleaned. I handled customer complaints. I answered phone calls. I updated inventory. I accepted deliveries. I organized storage rooms. I opened and closed the store. There were days when I didn't sit down for 8 or 9 hours. The worst part was the deliveries. Several times each week, trucks would arrive carrying large shipments of merchandise. Boxes filled with cleaning supplies, kitchen appliances, decorations, and other products would be stacked inside the truck. In a properly staffed workplace, unloading those deliveries would be shared among several employees. At our store, it was usually just me. The delivery drivers would leave the pallets near the entrance, and I would spend hours moving everything inside. Some boxes weighed over 20 kilograms. Others were awkward and difficult to carry because of their size. During winter, I carried heavy bags of seasonal inventory through snow and slush. During summer, I unloaded trucks in suffocating heat. When I asked whether someone could help during delivery days, the answer was always the same. We can't afford extra staff. That phrase became the unofficial motto of the business. We can't afford extra staff. We can't afford another register. We can't afford paid overtime. We can't afford new equipment. We can't afford additional breaks. Somehow, they could always afford renovations to their office. My coworkers felt the same frustration. There weren't many of us because turnover was incredibly high. New employees would arrive optimistic and leave a few months later completely burned out. One coworker lasted 6 weeks. Another lasted 3 months. One quit in the middle of a shift and never came back. I couldn't even blame them. The strange thing was that the employees got along well with each other. We supported one another because nobody else would. When we worked overlapping shifts, we shared advice and warned each other about upcoming deliveries. Good luck tomorrow. 3 pallets are arriving. The owners scheduled you alone on Saturday. They cut another shift from next week's schedule. It felt less like coworkers exchanging information and more like survivors warning each other about incoming disasters. One of my closest coworkers was a woman named Sarah. She had worked there longer than I had and knew every corner of the business. She taught me how to handle inventory errors, difficult customers, and the endless shortcuts the owners used to save money. One evening, after we finished organizing a shipment, she looked around the stockroom and shook her head. This place is going to hurt someone someday. At the time, I thought she was exaggerating. I wish she had been. As months turned into years, the workload kept increasing. The owners expanded their product selection without hiring additional staff. More inventory meant more deliveries. More deliveries meant more lifting. More lifting meant more physical strain. Meanwhile, customers expected the same level of service. Imagine trying to unload heavy boxes while simultaneously helping customers find products. It happened constantly. I would be carrying merchandise into the stockroom when someone would ask for assistance. I put the box down. Help the customer. Return to unloading. Get interrupted again. Answer a phone call. Return to unloading. Ring up purchases. Return to unloading. By the end of the day, I often felt like I had done 3 different jobs at the same time. Lunch breaks were another joke. Technically, we were entitled to breaks. In reality, being the only employee in the store meant there was nobody to cover for you. So what was I supposed to do? Lock the doors and leave customers outside? Most days I ate standing up behind the register. If customers entered, I immediately stopped eating. Sometimes my food sat untouched for hours until it was cold. Other times I simply threw it away at the end of the shift. The owners knew exactly what was happening. They visited often enough to see it themselves. Yet every complaint received the same response. If you managed last week, you can manage this week. Eventually I stopped complaining. I focused on surviving each shift. I told myself that hard work would eventually be recognized. I believed that loyalty mattered. I believed that if I continued giving everything I had, the company would eventually treat me better. Looking back, that was probably my biggest mistake. Because while I was sacrificing my health to keep their business running, they were already showing me exactly how much they valued their employees. And I was about to learn just how dangerous that could become. Around my second year at the store, I started noticing something. Nobody stayed long enough to become a senior employee. People either quit or burned out. The owners seemed completely comfortable with that cycle. Instead of fixing the problems that drove people away, they simply hired someone new and repeated the process. Training new employees usually fell on us. Not management. Not the owners. Us. The same exhausted workers who were already struggling to keep up with daily responsibilities. I remember spending entire shifts teaching new hires while simultaneously running the register, answering customer questions, processing deliveries, and trying to restock shelves. Many of those employees looked shocked after their first week. The job they had been promised during the interview wasn't the job they actually received. More than once I heard some variation of, "Wait, we're unloading deliveries ourselves? Why is there only one person scheduled all day? When do we actually take lunch?" The answers were always disappointing. Yes, because the owners refused to hire enough people. Whenever possible, the owners avoided being physically present in the store. They monitored everything remotely. Sales numbers, schedules, inventory reports, employee hours. What they didn't monitor was reality. They saw spreadsheets. We lived the consequences. One of the biggest sources of tension was scheduling. The owners constantly cut hours to save money. Sometimes there were periods where the schedule barely made sense. Employees would close the store at night and then be expected to return early the next morning. Requests for days off were treated like personal attacks. Sick days were even worse. I once caught a severe flu and could barely stand. When I called to explain that I had a fever, the owner's first question wasn't whether I was okay. It was, "Can you still come in for a few hours?" At some point, I stopped expecting basic concern. I wasn't an employee to them. I was labor, a cost, a number on a spreadsheet. Around that same time, Sarah finally reached her breaking point. She had spent years carrying the store on her back. Customers loved her. Employees trusted her. She knew more about the business than the owners did. One afternoon, she handed in her resignation. The news spread quickly among the staff. Nobody was surprised. We were only surprised she had lasted as long as she did. Before leaving, she pulled me aside. "I know you're reliable," she said. "That's why they'll keep giving you more work." She wasn't wrong. After Sarah left, many of her responsibilities quietly became mine. No raise, no promotion, no additional support, just more work. I was now expected to handle inventory discrepancies, supplier communications, and additional paperwork on top of everything else. The owners praised me constantly. First, I appreciated it. Then I realized something. Praise had become a substitute for actual support. Every conversation followed the same pattern. "You're doing an amazing job. We don't know what we'd do without you. You're one of our best employees." Then they'd ask me to take on another responsibility. Eventually, those compliments started sounding less like appreciation and more like manipulation. By then I had developed constant back pain. Nothing severe at first. Just soreness. Then stiffness. Then days where lifting boxes became genuinely painful. I mentioned it several times. The response was predictable. "Be careful when lifting." That was it. No equipment. No assistance. No changes. Just be careful. As if being careful somehow made a 25-kilogram box weigh less. The most frustrating part was that customers noticed what management ignored. Regular customers often saw me working alone. They watched me run between shelves, the register, deliveries, and customer service. Some would actually ask where everyone else was. I'd laugh and make a joke. Inside, I was exhausted. One older customer became a regular partly because she felt sorry for me. Every time she visited, she'd shake her head and say, "You're still doing this place by yourself?" I never knew how to answer, because the truth sounded ridiculous. Yes, most days I really was. As time passed, I became so accustomed to being overworked that I stopped recognizing how abnormal everything was. Working through lunch became normal. Lifting heavy inventory became normal. Covering multiple positions became normal. Being physically exhausted every evening became normal. I adapted because I thought I had to. Then another major change happened. I found out I was pregnant. First, only my husband knew. The pregnancy was still early, and we wanted to keep it private until we felt more confident. We were excited. Nervous but excited. We talked about the future. About becoming parents. About eventually moving somewhere bigger. About creating a stable life together. At work, nothing changed. I didn't immediately tell management because I wasn't ready to share the news yet. Besides, I had already learned how little they cared about employee well-being. Part of me worried they would simply see the pregnancy as an inconvenience. So I continued working. I continued unloading deliveries. I continued lifting boxes. I continued covering shifts. I continued skipping meals. Looking back now, I wish I had slowed down. I wish I had listened to my body. But when you've spent years being told that pushing through pain is normal, you stop recognizing warning signs. You convince yourself you're fine. You convince yourself you can handle one more shift. One more delivery. One more week. Unfortunately, my body was reaching its limit. I just didn't realize it yet. And the day everything finally went wrong started like every other ordinary shift. The day everything happened wasn't some unusually terrible day. That's what still bothers me. There wasn't a major emergency. There wasn't a workplace accident. There wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was just another normal shift. And that was the problem. I arrived early that morning and immediately noticed a delivery truck parked outside. Several large pallets were waiting for me. Of course they were. I checked the schedule. Just as expected, I was working alone. The owners knew the shipment was arriving. They had approved it days earlier. They also knew I was the only employee scheduled for most of the day. Apparently, they saw no issue with that. I started unloading inventory before opening the store. Box after box. Shelf after shelf. Back and forth. The same routine I had repeated hundreds of times before. By the time customers started arriving, I was already tired. Then the interruptions began. A customer needed help finding a product. Another had a return. The phone kept ringing. Someone needed information about an order. Another customer wanted recommendations. Every task pulled me away from the delivery. Every interruption meant more time spent running between different responsibilities. Hours passed. I still hadn't eaten. At one point I realized I hadn't even finished my coffee. It was sitting somewhere in the stockroom, completely forgotten. Around lunchtime I started feeling strange. Not sick exactly. Just off. A little dizzy. A little weak. I assumed it was stress. Or exhaustion. Or maybe low blood sugar from skipping meals again. None of those possibilities seemed unusual. They had all happened before. So I ignored it. Like I always did. I kept working. The shipment still needed to be unloaded. Customers still needed assistance. The register still needed someone standing behind it. The store wasn't going to run itself. I remember lifting another heavy box from one of the pallets. I remember feeling a sharp pain in my abdomen. Not unbearable, but enough to make me stop for a second. I put the box down, took a breath, waited for the pain to pass. Then I continued working. Because that was what years at that job had trained me to do. Keep moving. Keep working. Ignore discomfort. Push through. The dizziness got worse. The store suddenly felt too bright. Too loud. I remember helping a customer at the register and struggling to focus on what she was saying. I kept blinking because my vision seemed slightly blurred. The customer asked if I was okay. I smiled automatically. Just a little tired. That answer had become a reflex. A few minutes later I walked toward the stockroom. And that's where my memory becomes fragmented. I remember grabbing a shelf for support. I remember another wave of pain. I remember feeling like the floor shifted beneath me. Then nothing. The next thing I knew, I was opening my eyes to unfamiliar voices. For a few seconds I had no idea where I was. Everything felt distant, confused. Someone was speaking to me. Another person was asking questions. Then I realized I was lying on the floor. Several customers were nearby. One of them had called emergency services. Apparently I had collapsed in the middle of the store. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Maybe seconds. Maybe longer. The paramedics arrived quickly. They asked me questions, checked my vitals, helped me onto a stretcher. I remember feeling embarrassed, which sounds ridiculous now. But after years of being expected to handle everything myself, my first reaction wasn't concern for my health. It was guilt. I kept thinking about the store, about the customers, about the unfinished delivery, even while being loaded into an ambulance. That mindset took a long time to unlearn. At the hospital, things became more serious. Doctors ordered tests. More questions followed. Then one doctor asked something that caught me completely off guard. "Is there any chance you might be pregnant?" I looked at my husband. He looked at me. Neither of us answered immediately. Because yes, there was. The doctor nodded and ordered additional testing. The waiting that followed felt endless. I remember staring at the wall. I remember my husband holding my hand. I remember trying to convince myself everything would be fine. People faint for all kinds of reasons. Maybe I was dehydrated. Maybe I was overworked. Maybe it was nothing serious. I wanted to believe that. Then the doctor returned, and everything changed. The pregnancy was confirmed. But there was another problem, a much bigger one. I still struggle to describe that conversation even now. The doctor explained everything carefully, professionally, kindly, but the meaning was devastating. I had lost the pregnancy, my first pregnancy, the child we had barely begun planning our future around. Gone. One moment I was learning that I was going to be a mother. The next I was learning that I wasn't. At least not then. I don't remember much after that. Only pieces. My husband crying. The silence in the hospital room. The feeling that the world had suddenly become unreal. The physical pain was difficult. The emotional pain was worse. Far worse. Over the following days I replayed everything repeatedly. Every skipped meal. Every heavy box. Every delivery. Every complaint management ignored. Every time I had asked for help and been told the company couldn't afford it. I wasn't looking for someone to blame for my grief. I knew life doesn't always provide clear answers. But one thought kept returning. The conditions in that store were not normal. They were not safe. And they were not unavoidable. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I realized how easily this could happen to someone else. And for the first time since I started working there, I stopped asking myself how much more I could endure. Instead, I started asking a different question. Why had we tolerated it for so long? The answer to that question would eventually lead me somewhere I never expected to go. A courtroom. After I was discharged from the hospital, I took some time away from work. Physically, I was recovering. Emotionally, I was barely functioning. The grief came in waves. Some days I could get through the morning without crying. Some days I couldn't. What surprised me most was what happened when the owners finally contacted me. Not once did they ask how I was coping. Not once did they ask whether I needed support. Not once did they express genuine concern about what had happened. Instead, they wanted to know when I would be returning. That conversation changed something inside me. For years I had defended them. For years I had explained away every problem. For years I had convinced myself that they were doing their best. Now I saw the situation differently. I wasn't dealing with a difficult workplace. I was dealing with owners who had knowingly created unsafe working conditions and expected employees to accept them. The more distance I got from the job, the clearer everything became. I began documenting everything I could remember. Schedules showing employees working alone. Messages discussing deliveries. Records of staffing shortages. Witnesses who had seen the conditions firsthand. Former coworkers started reaching out after hearing what happened. Some of them shared stories I hadn't even known about. Employees working while sick. Skip breaks. Unpaid overtime. Safety concerns that had been reported and ignored. People lifting loads that should have required multiple workers. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Eventually, I spoke with an attorney. I expected a short conversation. Instead, we spent hours reviewing documents and discussing workplace practices. At one point, he looked up from a stack of papers and said, "This is bigger than one bad day." That sentence stayed with me. Because he was right. The collapse wasn't the real issue. The real issue was everything that led up to it. Years of understaffing. Years of ignored complaints. Years of cutting costs at the expense of employees. The legal process moved slowly. Much slower than I expected. There were meetings, statements, evidence requests, more paperwork than I thought possible. The owners fought hard. According to them, everything had been perfectly reasonable. According to them, employees were treated fairly. According to them, nobody had ever raised serious concerns. Then former employees started giving statements. Former coworkers I hadn't spoken to in years came forward, including Sarah. Especially Sarah. She described the staffing problems, the unrealistic expectations, the deliveries, the skipped breaks, the constant pressure to do more with less. Others confirmed the same things. Different people, different time periods, the same story, again and again. What shocked me was how many former employees were willing to speak. For years we had all assumed we were struggling alone. The court process eventually revealed that nearly everyone had experienced the same problems. The difference was that most people simply left. I had stayed long enough for the consequences to catch up with me. The hearing itself was stressful. I won't pretend otherwise. Sitting across from the owners felt surreal. These were people I had spent years trying to help. People whose business I had worked hard to support. People who had repeatedly told me I was one of their most valuable employees. Now they acted as if I was exaggerating. As if the conditions in the store had existed only in my imagination. Fortunately, facts are stubborn things. Schedules existed. Messages existed. Witnesses existed. Records existed. The evidence painted a picture that was difficult to dispute. When the decision finally came, the court ruled in my favor. I cried when I heard the outcome. Not because of the money. The compensation helped, of course. But that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was acknowledgement. Someone had finally looked at the situation and said, "This wasn't acceptable." The owners were ordered to compensate me. Additional workplace violations were also addressed. For the first time in years, I felt like someone had actually listened. I never returned to that store. A few months later, it changed management. Several employees left. Others told me conditions eventually improved. I genuinely hoped they did. Nobody should have to experience what we did. As for me, I spent a long time rebuilding my life. Learning how to rest. Learning that taking breaks wasn't laziness. Learning that my worth wasn't measured by how much pain I could tolerate. My husband was patient through all of it. There were difficult months. There were setbacks. There were days when the future felt uncertain. But little by little things got better. Then, more than a year later, we received news that terrified and excited us at the same time. I was pregnant again. The entire pregnancy felt different. Not because something was wrong. Because I was afraid to hope. Every appointment felt important. Every milestone felt significant. I worried constantly. My husband worried too. But this time things went well. Slowly, cautiously, we allowed ourselves to become excited. Months passed. The due date got closer. And eventually I left the workforce entirely to prepare for motherhood. Today my husband is the one working while I stay home. And that brings me to the reason I'm posting this update. Edit 1 week later. A week ago I gave birth to a healthy baby boy. As I write this, he's asleep nearby. The house is quieter than usual. I'm exhausted in a completely different way now. Not from unloading deliveries. Not from running between customers. Not from carrying an entire business on my shoulders. I'm exhausted because I'm learning how to be a mother. And honestly, it's the most meaningful job I've ever had. Sometimes I think about that store. Sometimes I think about the woman I was back then. The woman who skipped meals because there was too much work to do. The woman who believed being overworked was normal. The woman who thought asking for help meant failing. I wish I could tell her something. A job should never cost you your health. Loyalty should never require self-destruction. And no employer is worth sacrificing your future for. If you're working in conditions that feel wrong, don't ignore it the way I did. Document everything. Speak up. Know your rights. And remember that being a good employee does not mean accepting mistreatment. It took me years to learn that lesson. But I finally did. And now, while holding my son, I know one thing for certain. No paycheck was ever worth what that job took from me.